was possibly one of the reasons why Dr. Williams ensured, we're actually stepping a little bit into the review now, but it's good, why he ensured that when we went around to the whole country, which is what we did, we went to all the provinces, etc., we had people there from the Defense Secretariat. Just some of the names, we had Mr. Tsepi Mtumi, who's now Director General of Military Veterans. We had Mr. Nick Sendel, who's also a very senior official in the Secretariat. We had representatives from all the services. We had a senior Air Force officer, Colonel Wilcock. We had a senior Army officer, Colonel Golis then. They all later became generals. And we sat and we spoke these issues. We spoke these uncomfortable issues with the people of South Africa. We spoke the issues. I was tackled often with regard to the Navy throughout the entire country, where people would go and say, guys, why do you need frigates? Why do we need a Navy? And what was very good is it actually helped us to explain. And we went around and to lots of people in the hinterland, we would go and say, are you aware that 55% of the GDP of this country passes through our ports? And people were not aware of that. And are you aware that 80% of our exports by value, 90% by tonnage, all go through our ports? If we cannot trade, if we cannot do what we meant to do, there won't be an economy here. Our oil, most of it, bar sassel, comes from the sea. All those things, and that's before we start talking about supporting the people who look after our fish, etc., and making sure that people don't spend or steal our alluvial diamonds which lie on the seabed. And I think all these broad realizations helped people understand that you can have guns and butter.
You've already laid a foundation on a subject that...
To the first two paragraphs, setting up the review, and then finishing off with a small statement on transformation signed by Minister Modise. So if I may, the very first paragraph on page 20, say, it featured 3 national consultative conferences, a host of regional workshops in all provinces, public hearings in Parliament, and a special conference on the issue of the liability to serve in times of crisis of our volunteer service men and women. And then the next paragraph also, which we're going to talk to later, it drew together a wide range of interest groups, including academics, South African academics and international academics. It included clergy from any churches. It included industrialists. It included the media, pacifists, whose objectives were to shut down the military. It included parliamentarians, our elected civil authorities, and members of the defense establishment, bringing into being a real defense family. So it was fully inclusive and reflected the discussion and the dynamic of South Africa at that stage.
I see that we are already into the defense review. Just to make everybody to be with us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, sir. So the white paper was broad brush, high-level policy, focusing specifically on the human dynamics of the new South Africa, and was setting the scene for perhaps more nuts and bolts at a lower level of policy, filling in the various gaps from which tangible inputs may be taken and tangible and substantive decisions could be made. So I think, Admiral Green, Mr. Chairman, sir, they participated. Period.
Remember, on your CV, you represented a high official of the South African National Defence Force at the Defence Review level. From your experience, I would like you to give the nuts and bolts of their participation.
Thank you very much, sir. So with regard to the participation in the Defence Review Working Group, the working group itself comprised of people from the Department of Defense. It included civilians from the Secretariat, and it serving and covering all the services. In addition to that, it includes members of the elected civil authorities, parliamentarians. Just by name, there were three of them who I can recall. From the ruling party, it was Ms. Zoe Cotter and Mr. Rapu Matlikani, who brought some very good insights into things. And then, I think it might have been from the official opposition, and I'm not quite sure, but it was somebody, I believe, from the New National Party called Mr. Johan Murray, who also brought in very good perspectives from his side. So they were the political people who were involved in the process and also helped ensure that we did not stray too far from de facto what the Joint Standing Committee on Defence and what Parliament was actually going to be looking at eventually.
If one were to ask
of the SANDF, so that we have a motivated, disciplined, and adequately equipped force to carry out its constitutional responsibilities for the 21st century.
This paragraph emphasizes or deals with adequately equipped.
So I think what was on the minds of the participants was that it was imperative that the South African National Defence Force would have to re-equip itself. And I think that as people participated more and more, there was a broad understanding of what it was. In those days, people were also very aware that defence expenditure had been cut considerably from where it was a decade or two earlier. And in fact, just speaking to people in Broad Civvy Street, with a review and having people come in, there was actually very little understanding of what defence expenditure was. Certain peoples tended to think, the civilians out there tended to think that the military probably spent more than 20 or 30% of government's expenditure. They expected out of every 100 cents, maybe 20 or 30 cents to be spent on the army in particular, the Air Force and the Navy to a lesser extent. And people were exceedingly surprised when they saw actually how little we were spending out of the government purse.
At this stage, I would like you to put your cap on as a Navy officer. I want to take you to your statement, because at a later stage, I want to get back to the defense review where we deal with, ask you a compound question.
Sir, the Navy acquired 4 frigates of 120 meters in length, of about 3,500 tons, frigates which were capable of conducting autonomous, sustained operations in virtually any sea condition, as well as 3 Heroine-class 209 submarines.
We'll get back there. All that I wanted...
Mr. Chair, sir, I'd hate to say the Navy was given preference or not given preference. I couldn't judge on that one. But I can set the basis for the rationale of our arguments, which, funny enough, were very well honed through the defense review process because we had people like Mr. Terry Crawford Brown participating fully in these things. And he challenged us on every issue, and everybody else challenged us on every issue. So it was wonderful because it actually put us to the test. But as a point of departure with regard to the Navy, the first thing is South Africa is a maritime nation. The history of this country has been impacted by forces which have come from across the sea. The naval philosopher who's probably one of the most smartest persons I've ever read was an Admiral A.T. Mahan. He wrote a number of books as a captain, and in fact was perhaps the forerunner and one of the founding fathers of the U.S. Naval War College, which I was privileged to attend just after our elections in 1994, which we discussed yesterday. And in a nutshell, what Admiral Mahan said is, it is a nation which has a great navy, which becomes a greater nation. And I'll say that again because it's very important to grasp this. Pardon me, sir. It is a nation which has a great navy, which becomes a greater nation. And Admiral Mahan wrote that about the effect of Navy power on history. And a lot of his focus was on the British Royal Navy. He looked at Britain and saw Britain, this tiny island nation, yet had so much influence through the entire globe, to the interest of many allies in the globe, but primarily to the interests of Great Britain. And he wrote heavily to that, because the reality is, if Britain did not have a strong navy, we would probably never have even been speaking English in this country today. Britain was able to go and extend their influence by means of their navy around the globe. And that was the point of departure, sir. And when we're talking about strategic utilization of our frigates and our submarines, later on in my testimony, I will explain some of the personal experiences I have had. Make South Africa a great nation.
You may proceed.
Thank you, sir. So I would just like to bring something when we're talking about the war-fighting side and people and defending and so on, which we're going to talk about in the Project Optimum and the Defense Review. And today I think people are very aware of nations moving across the world and imposing their will on other nations in not a friendly manner. And often a lot of South Africans need to be reminded of the Anglo-Boer War. The British who came here and fought here for British objectives. And the reality is they were able to muster and to bring 450,000 troops to fight in South Africa. There were almost 500,000 troops who came here to quell the Boers. And those troops came by the sea, sir. They did not fly in. There were no aircraft. Nobody had dreamt of the Air Force at that stage. God bless their souls. But the reality is they came by sea. They came by sea because Britain controlled the sea. And that influenced events, and it influenced what has happened in this country over the last few hundred years. The second time there was major impact here, perhaps not as in the face as 450,000 occupying troops, was the Second World War. In the Second World War, there were over 140 ships which were sunk off the South African coast. They were sunk by German surface ships, German submarines, German mines. They were sunk by Japanese submarines who were operating off our coast here. That is the reality of history. And I think as we go down the line, it is very important just to keep that in the back of one's mind as we move into the future. You know, South Africa is a wonderful place, and I'm a very proud fifth-generation South African. And I want to make sure that my kids and everybody else's kids have got a wonderful future based on what we decide, not based on what some invading country may decide because we have not met our constitutional mandate. The reality is we must go there and we must be able to do that. And the Navy is fundamental, not with a poor Air Force and Army. We want a strong Air Force and a strong Army because we want that balance and we need each other. But it is those type of things and that understanding which will allow us to actually meet our constitutional obligations and to move on together with everybody.
Thank you for that background, Admiral. The significance of the acquisition process in as far as getting equipment for the Navy in the context that I've just directed you to them?
Thank you very much, sir. I think what was significant in the process and the whole ethos of the white paper in the defense review is that everything was transparent. Everybody worked down the line. Largely what I've mentioned to you now was discussed in all these regional workshops. The people who were prepared to go there and listen, we discussed these things, and we were challenged on all issues, particularly the relationship between frigates and submarines, and we'll discuss that later. But the reality is, I believe that there was very fair legitimacy with regard to that. And in addition, sir, to the war-fighting side, which we've spoken about, which is our constitutional mandate, and the British coming in here, God bless their souls, they are our friends today. They are our best friends. But the reality is our Navy is there to make sure that if the British are here, it's because we want them to be here, and not because they will enforce their will on us. But the reality is it's the ability to protect South Africa against any would-be aggressor. It's the fact of our maritime trade being so fundamental to the butter side of the guns and butter debate. If you can't get oil in here, Sasol can only produce so many things, and not all of us will be able to come through to Sammy Marks today. The reality is you've got to have those ships, and those ships, they've got to move in and out there. And for that, we need a strong Navy and an Air Force to actually help that it can happen. But taking it to the next line, there's just another dimension which I'd like to talk upon, sir. And Advocate Cooper raised it with Admiral Green yesterday. It is just concerning our territory at sea. We've got our exclusive economic zone, which takes us out and it gives us the right of fish and everything out to about 320 kilometers. And in total, that gives us about 1.5 million square kilometers of exclusive economic zone around South Africa and around our islands. But just as a form of reference, the land mass of South Africa is just over 1.2 million square kilometers. So we've got 1.2 million square kilometers of turf here. Our exclusive economic zone, just over 1.5 million, a little bit more, but then something of great significance, sir. In 2009, South Africa put in a bid at the United Nations with regard to our extended continental shelf claim. And this is in accordance with new legislation, which Petro SA is leading, but which the South African Navy, with our hydrographic capability, played a significant role in extending our claim to another 1.8, an additional 1.8 million square kilometers plus. So it would mean that stuff on the seabed, below the seabed, in that, if there's gas or oil, our great-great-grandchildren will be benefiting from that. So the reality, if we tally those two things together, we've got 1.2 million here, we've got just short of 3.6 million square kilometers of stuff which belongs to us out at sea. And I think the reality is we don't know what's under the seabed there for the future. The issue which people in Europe often debate is how the North Sea was divided up between Denmark and Norway. When the North Sea was divided, people had little idea that there was oil under the North Sea. And a few decades ago, Norway was probably one of the poorest countries in Europe. But with the formula which was used to divide the North Sea and the subsequent oil which was found out of there, Norway today, I believe, is the fourth or fifth largest exporter of oil in the world. It's probably one of the wealthiest countries in Europe, and possibly one of the countries with of the highest GDPs in the world, because they looked after and they were smart when they were checking what belonged to them at sea. And who knows what the future is going to hold with regard to our stuff. But here, for every 1 square kilometer we have got here, terra firma, we have got about 3 at sea. And in that context, if you take a look at it, I think it is exceedingly modest of us to invest so modestly in what we have invested in for the defending and protecting of those resources with 4 frigates and 3 submarines. So I think it's exceedingly modest. And comparing and looking at other international examples, I don't think that we are being over the top. I don't think it is toys for boys. Of course, now toys for boys and girls. It is not that. I think we've got to look at what we are, look at our interests, and go and make sure we capitalize on those interests. And the reality is, if we don't patrol, you don't control. We've got to be out there. We've got to make sure that we fund our people and make sure we retain sufficient expertise so that the frigates and submarines can be out there the whole time. And we must have not only them, we need stuff out there to ensure that South Africa remains being a great nation, but in accordance with Mahan, becomes a greater nation. Then I believe we will have done our duty. So,
Admiral Green, at this stage, I just want
trade and its vast maritime area make maritime defense a matter of great importance. The protection and defense of maritime lines of commerce during times of conflict and hostilities may prove crucial to the survival and well-being of our people.
Now, the importance of South Africa
country is directly and indirectly based on the use of the sea.
Decide that the Navy should be given preference to that extent to get this equipment. That's the basis upon which we would like you to appreciate this part of the testimony. And on those bases, we are ready for with the subject that we are dealing with of the SDPPs that started during or about post-1994.
The relevance of it today is that it has
with the subject that we are dealing with of the SDPPs that started during or about post-1994.
The relevance of it today is that it has formalized what started in the Constitution and then was actually taken by the White Paper. And the reality is it focuses us on the use of force. The military is about the use of force. And the use of force means that you have to have a capability to use force, and that capability has got two fundamental issues to it. It has got the issue of equipment, and it has the issue of professional military people who will make the equipment work. And that is the basis of thought from the Constitution, the Code of Conduct, into why we have a Navy, an Army, an Air Force, and SAMS to defend and protect South Africa.
Admiral Hicks, as far as the application of the 6.
Mr. Chairman, sir, that ethos reflected in that, I believe, was fully embraced by all serving military people who participated in the Defence Review and all the associated processes to help design and come up with the fact that we need certain equipment and we must be able to do that.
Admiral Hicks, just in passing, in relation to the SDPP packages, what is your comment? Arms, protecting and defending the Republic of South Africa, its people and integrity, and arms. And you I would appreciate if the chair could draw my attention if the chair has identified the relevant section.
South Africa, the fundamentals of defending and protecting South Africa, it is imperative for two elements. One is that you have to have the people, and two, you have to have the equipment. You've got to have that to be able to use force.
You'll remember that yesterday, when we adjourned, we were just about to deal with
Mr. Chairperson, sir, the Defence Review was informed.
Page 761, Annex Chart, RH88, to page 779. The witness is just going to deal with some excerpts from this reading. Volume.
Which page?
The witness is going to refer you first to page 762. Page 762. Are the commissioners with us on the page?
A suggestion. Can we just adjourn for 5-10 minutes and let somebody attend to the indexing of these files? Because the numbers are very, very faint. Can't see the numbers.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, we'll adjourn.
All right. the subject that we are dealing with, of the SDPPs that started during or about post-1994.
The relevance of it today is that it has formalized what started in the Constitution and then was actually taken by the white paper, and the reality is it focuses us on the use of force. The military is about the use of force, and the use of force means that you have to have a capability to use force, and that capability has got two fundamental issues to it. It has got the issue of equipment, and it has the issue of professional military people who will make the equipment work. And that is the basis of thought from the Constitution, the Code of Conduct, into why we have a Navy, an Army, an Air Force, and SANS to defend and protect South Africa.
Admiral Hicks, as far as the application of the six.
Mr. Chairman, sir, that ethos reflected in that, I believe, was fully embraced by all serving military people who participated in the Defence Review and all the associated processes to help design and come up with the fact that we need certain equipment and we must be able to do that.
Admiral Hicks, just in passing, in relation to the SDPP packages, what is your comment? Arms, protecting and defending the Republic of South Africa, its people and integrity, and arms. And you I would appreciate if the chair could draw my attention if the chair has identified the relevant section.
In South Africa, the fundamentals of defending and protecting South Africa, it is imperative for two elements. One is that you have to have the people, and two, you have to have the equipment. You've got to have that to be able to use force.
You'll remember that yesterday, when we adjourned, we were just about to deal with
Mr. Chairperson, sir, the Defence Review was informed.
Page 761, Annex Chart, RH88, to page 779. The witness is just going to deal with some excerpts from this reading. Volume.
Which page?
The witness is going to refer you first to page 762. Page 762. Are the commissioners with us on the page?
A suggestion. Can we just adjourn for 5-10 minutes and let somebody attend to the indexing of these funds? Because the numbers are very, very faint to consider them.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, we'll adjourn.
All right.
Commission on the limits of the continental shelf in accordance with Article 76, paragraph 8 of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, that's UNCLOS, information on the limits of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles from the baseline from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured in respect of the mainland of the territory of the RSA. Upon completion of the considerations of the submission, the Commission will make recommendations pursuant to Article 76 of the Convention. And at this stage, I believe indications are that South Africa will be successful in this claim.
Now, I gather that when you talk about exclusive economic zone, you are referring to the fish in the water and the stuff on the ocean floor.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
I gather that when you talk about the continental shelf, you talk about the diamonds, the oil, and the gas below our ocean.
That is my understanding, Mr. Chairman.
How significant it is to have capabilities to protect the mainland, the economic zone, and the continental shelf?
Mr. Chairman, sir, I think it's of great significance. The reality is that 80% of our globe, or 70% of our globe, is covered by the sea, by water. So it is very, very important that people who have interests at sea are able to patrol what they have interests in. And there is an adage which says, if you do not patrol, you do not control. And that is the broad rationale that the Navy has a role to play there. In addition, the other departments of state also have varying roles which they play at sea.
If, for instance, we didn't have the capabilities and the competency to patrol this ocean, to look after our continental shelf, to look after our exclusive economic zone, just imagine the consequences that would happen, and please address the Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think things would be at risk if people, and here we're coming to deterrence also, which we will be discussing later on in the Defence Review, but the reality is if the bad people out there know that South Africa has a capability with the right equipment and with the right people who are well trained, who are professional, if they do not trust that we have that capability, they could very possibly take chances which would not be in the interest of South Africa. They could do things which actually go against what the Constitution instructs us to do in defending and protecting South Africa and her territory.
For proceeding on page 2 of the statement, I would like you to read paragraph 11.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Paragraph 11 at the bottom of page 2. Excuse me, sir. Maritime warfare is a multi-dimensional and effective maritime defense requiring balanced air, surface, and subsurface capabilities. Surface vessels can conduct sustained operations, maintaining a presence unequaled by other systems, and have substantial capabilities in countering aircraft, other surface vessels, and submarines. Frigates or corvettes are the workhorses of any navy. They are capable of conducting sustained operations in sea conditions like those off the South African coast. Submarines also play a vital role. They control their visibility and pose a threat to even the most sophisticated surface forces, thus providing great deterrence and defense value.
What comment would you like to make about the capabilities mentioned in the frigates and the submarines in as far as deterrence and value of the constitutional operational mandate of the SABC is concerned?
Mr. Chairman, sir, I believe that the frigates and the submarines are fundamental to the deterrence to ensure that we meet our constitutional mandate. The submarines and the frigates complement each other in capability. At significantly higher cost to attempt to achieve the same deterrent and defense value. Aircraft provide area coverage and a rapid response capability that ships and submarines cannot equal. There is thus a complementary relationship between these elements, and the neglect of any one has a disproportionate effect on the overall defense capability.
You have to put your cap on as a member of the SABC because these three arms of services are mentioned in relation to the role that could be played by the submarines. Please comment.
So I think the reality is that in warfare at sea, you must have a subsurface capability where nobody knows that you are there. Under the sea, radar does not work. Under the sea, you cannot see. You cannot look and see clearly. You have to use sonar, which is sound, to try to detect something under the sea. What makes it very special of South Africa is that we have warm water coming down from Mozambique and cold water coming up from the Antarctic, and they meet off our Cape Coast. And where they meet, there is confusion in the sea, and that makes it very, very difficult for people to detect a submarine. So it gives the advantage to a submarine if the submarine OC is well trained and knows his area. So it is that, together with a surface capability, the surface capability having a helicopter on board, a helicopter being able to be deployed to extend the visual and detection range of the surface elements, to transmit with sophisticated data methodology back to the ship or to the submarine to help give it information with regard to potential hostile forces, and it can also play a role in helping target weapons onto hostile forces. In addition to that, the issue with regard to fixed-wing aircraft over the sea is very important, and at this stage it is not the subject of this discussion, but it is something where we are thin and where I know the Chief of the Air Force is looking into, because we need to have a balanced set of capabilities. So the Air Force plays a significant role in the whole equation.
When the helicopter is on the deck of a frigate, under whose control is it? Is it under the control of the Air Force or under the control of the Navy? I would like you to deal with this complementary relationship at this stage.
Once an aircraft is given to a frigate, we say it is chopped to the frigate, it will be under the control of the officer commanding of that frigate. So it will perform a function as part of a sensor or a weapon system of that surface combatant. Therefore, it is very, very important that the Air Force and the Navy work closely with each other, and that the people are used to working with each other to ensure greatest interoperability. The organizations are slightly different in culture. That is why you cannot take anything for granted. But we, when we are at sea in our frigates, we welcome the Air Force crew very, very warmly, because it is the flight crew but also the support crew which are both very important to make sure that they are comfortable in deploying with us, obviously for extended periods, to optimize the use of the helicopter. Something about that, and if I may just refer to the model across there for those who haven't seen it, but there's a model of our frigate and a model of the submarine on top of it. On the flight deck of the frigate, you will see a helicopter, and things look reasonable.
The witness is referring the commissioners to two contraptions which are just below the desk of the commissioners. I'm certain that the next witnesses might be talking to a flash disk that might be projected into a screen to demonstrate these capabilities, because commissioners, we cannot talk about these capabilities in the abstract. These are things that can be touched and that can be seen. Unfortunately, from the point where you are, you may not see them, but let's park it at this stage and let the witness proceed, and when the time comes, the relevance of the two contraptions in relation to the projection will simplify the testimony. Thank you, Chair, Commissioners. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just an issue which one has to bear in mind also concerning the interoperability is that when a ship is in port, it is pretty stable. But when that frigate is at sea and it is moving around and the sea is big, then the pilot has to be exceedingly skilled to go and land his helicopter on a deck below him, which is weaving and moving through considerable extremes. So one needs a great level of worked upness and of cooperation to make sure that we operate the entire system properly.
We've laid the foundation of the importance of the frigate and the submarines. And on page 3, the next paragraph, paragraph 13, I would like you to deal with the brief history of the acquisition of the Daphne submarines that were commissioned in 1971, 1972. Of significance is to demonstrate how important these frigates and submarines have always been to South Africa, not starting in 1994, leading to the white paper into the Defence Review.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Submarines provide highly credible threat to any potential enemy or aggressor and are extremely effective covert surveillance platforms. The presence of submarines vastly complicates the freedom of operation as well as force composition of any aggressor, regardless of his strength or potential. Submarines serve as the very subtle instruments for the projection of power over long ranges. Their presence needs not be known, but even so they are used across the full spectrum of activity from peacekeeping through escalating tension and crisis to war. Our Daphne submarines were built in France and commissioned in 1971 and 1972. They were becoming increasingly difficult and expensive to support, and it was envisaged that by the year 2005, they would no longer be cost-effective or possible to maintain them and the required level of operational effectiveness and safety. The usual design life of submarines was about 30 years. What was also significant, Mr. Chairman, is that in the mid-70s, we had another 2 submarines which were on order. They were 2 French-built Augusta submarines, which also, as a result of the arms embargo, were not allowed to come to South Africa. So the force design, which was in the implementation phase in the 70s, included 5 submarines, 2 Daphne coastal submarines and 2 Augusta, which were medium-range submarines. The 2 Augusta submarines ended up being sold by the French to Pakistan later. If I may continue, sir, the next paragraph, a project to acquire 4 new submarines for delivery in the 1990s was approved but was then later cancelled. Due to the long lead time for submarine acquisition, it became necessary to initiate the Daphne-class submarine replacement.
Historically, submarines have been important for South Africa, even prior to 1994. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Was this reality considered during the deliberations of the white paper that we know that you're well versed with, but you did not participate in leading to the defense review?
Mr. Chairman, I would imagine that it would have been at the forefront of people's minds when talking force design and order of battle. But of course, the white paper was setting up the scene. It didn't really focus so much on the nuts and bolts and whether we were going to go with which combination, sir.
Albeit, as at the stage of the white paper, the staff target, the specifics as to what type of submarine does the country need, what type of frigate does the country need, was not the subject of deliberation, but the issue was that capabilities were on the minds of the participants.
That is correct, sir. And if you would like me, I could indicate the huge dynamics in the South African Navy when there was the budget cut in late 89, early 1990, where the Navy leadership had to decide. At that stage, we had potential projects which would keep the Navy going. And the Navy was put in a position where it had to consider shutting down its projects or getting rid of people. And the leadership of the Navy was so concerned about the future of the Navy that it said a Navy without ships and submarines is not a Navy. And perhaps in the most puritanical sense then, because they were committed, the Navy leadership was committed to the Navy and South Africa and defending South Africa, the Navy put on the table that we would have to retrench over 2,000 people, hoping to keep projects alive. The reality is that the leadership of South Africa at that stage said, you may go ahead. And the Navy forcibly retrenched over 2,000 people because it believed that was the only way it would keep it going as a Navy into the future. I was a young commander at that stage, and it was traumatic for the Navy. People who join the Navy expecting and hoping to serve if they've got contracts, etc. And our ability, we grow up in the Navy and we are strong in the Navy. But the reality is there were people who gave their lives to the Navy as such, but in the interests of the broader Navy, over 2,000 people were retrenched. And there were a lot of people who adjusted very well. There were a number of people who did not adjust well. There were a number of people who actually ended up taking their lives. It was a very sad time. It was a very, very sad time. But the reality is it showed how important it was to make sure that the Navy had ships and submarines to do its duty.
As we are gravitating towards the acquisition of these capabilities, please go to paragraph 15, page 3 of the statement, surface combatants.
Thank you, sir. The SA Navy raised the requirement for new surface combatant vessels in 1980. And in fact, Admiral Schultz, when he testifies, he will testify to before that time, which he experienced and was comfortable to. But I will speak from 1980. Project Outward was then registered. This is 10 years before 1990, 14 years before our new constitution. Project Outward was then registered, but due to financial reasons, again, remained dormant until 1989 when a new Project Foreshore was launched. This defined the requirement for 4 multi-purpose, which is an anti-surface, anti-submarine, and anti-air vessels. This project was also cancelled because of lack of funds at the same time as I indicated with regard to the retrenchment, etc. So the retrenchment came, and after the retrenchment, the jolly axe still fell on the Navy.
What is significant about this process of acquisition before 1994 with regard to acquisition of these capabilities?
I think what is significant is that a Navy is always maintained. you maintain a navy, you are continuously renewing old equipment, making sure that you have those capabilities. And in our situation, finance has always been an issue. Finance has caused projects to be cancelled. Finance has caused the Navy to forcibly retrench over 2,000 people. So these are realities, and we've got to understand that, and we've got to work with it as best possible.
Paragraph 16 on page 4.
Thank you, sir. In the mid-1990s, the surface combat capability of the SA Navy was provided by 9 strike craft. So a strike craft, to give you an idea, is about 60 meters long and is between 400 and 450 tons in broad terms. And why I mention that is just to give you an idea of the frigate, which is 120 meters long and 3,500 tons. And a strike craft, if one looks at its displacement, and if one took 8 or 9 strike craft, they would have virtually the same displacement as one of our new frigates, just as a bit of an idea of how things fit in, sir. They say the strike craft had the attributes of speed, low signatures, that's signatures, radar signatures, infrared signatures, and visual signatures. They're small, low combat vessels. And they had very good offensive capabilities within their limited sensor horizons. They're limited sensor because they were relatively low in the water, particularly compared to our frigates. But also the following deficiencies. Their small size severely limited their mobility. Their weapons and their sensor performance and crew endurance in adverse sea conditions. They could not carry a helicopter to provide for over-the-horizon surveillance, for scouting, for targeting, or for attack. They lacked the space to provide for a formation command post facility. Their sea training capacity was very limited. The small size of the hull and the combat suite architecture severely limited the versatility of the vessel in terms of operational configuration and the growth or upgrade potential of onboard systems. In addition, they had no anti-submarine capability, and their design life was coming to its end with the first of these vessels having been built in 1977, the first 3 in Israel, and the last one being built in 1986. The last 6 of them were built in Durban.
The significance of this testimony shows the process in as far as acquisition is concerned, even before 1994. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairperson, Mr. Chairman.
In as far as the strike craft is concerned, between it and the frigates, what came first to South Africa?
Mr. Chairman, we had frigates. We had frigates which were built for South Africa, British frigates, which arrived here in the early 60s. Those were the President-class frigates, which Admiral Green referred to yesterday, and which Admiral Schultz will also talk to. There were 3 of them. That was the President Kruger, the President Steyn, and the President Pretorius. And as Admiral Schultz also, as Admiral Green also referred to yesterday, we tragically lost the SAS President Kruger in 1982 during exercises at night, with the tragic loss also of 16 members of the South African Navy. It is still something which we are very, very aware of. The dangers of operating at sea, everything associated with it. The sea is a very hostile place, and we are all continuously aware of that, and particularly in our seas here, which are very, very huge, the Cape of Storms. The strike craft, which arrived much later than the President-class frigates. President-class frigates in the 60s, the first strike craft having arrived here in the late 70s.
We know that the frigates have always been important for South Africa. They've always been wanted. But why got the strike craft instead of getting blue frigates?
So I think possibly, Mr. Chairman, I think possibly Admiral Schultz might be able to give you a better idea of that because he's specialized in the surface warfare side. But my understanding is that that decision was imposed on the Navy and that the Chief of the Navy did not have much say in it at that stage.
Now, we are at a stage where we have acquired strike crafts, which shows the development of the acquisition process that was there even prior to 1994. I've got to take you back to the defense review. Now remove your cap as a Navy officer. Go back to being a member of the South African National Defense Force. We're going to touch briefly on the defense review. I would like you to take the commission to Project Optima. This is very significant because we're going to the inner stage of your testimony now and the strategic utilization of the equipment we have acquired. Your role in the defense review, you've testified about it. Do you want to tell the commission about the conclusions from the defense reviews that shows the type of options or capability that would possess as South Africa in relation to the capabilities that you acquired? I see that you're frowning. I don't complete the question, but I'm certain that you pick up the theme of what I'm saying. Please don't hesitate to draw my attention if you think the question is too broad.
Mr. Chair, sir, I'm not sure if you'd like me to actually kick off and go through and work through the defense review or focus specifically on options, determining force design options.
You have laid the foundation of the defense review. You have demonstrated to the commission the white paper that you did not participate in, that it was a policy. The defense review was also a policy informed by the white paper, but the defense review had to operationalize this policy. Now we're at the stage where you want to conclude about the defense review to go into the Project Optimum, that I would like to simplify to the commission what does it entail. We're at the stage where we want to part ways with that historical link. We are now going towards the acquisition that makes this commission to be what it is. Am I making sense? Where you can start wherever you want to. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. So what I would like to do is to set the scene first and then link into optimum as well as the rationale which was used behind this. I mentioned earlier on that one of the fundamental challenges we had in the South Africa, in the strategic environment, how do we meet our constitutional responsibilities in the absence of a clearly defined threat? And this was of great significance and great importance to actually get to the bottom of this. And what I would like to do, sir, is I would like to refer you to RWH 7 on page 755.
Commissioners, we're going to the second volume of Higgs bundle, Annexure RWH 7 on page 755 up to 760. The witness would like to start on page?
I would like to start on page 756, if I may.
756, commissioners. Let's see whether the commissioners are on the same page. RWH 7, commissioners, starting on 755 up until 760. The witness would like to start on 756. I see the commissioners are nodding. Let's lay a background. I would like you to identify this important writing by starting on 7555. Acknowledge it at the top. Who wrote it? What is it about?
Sir, this is about an award which was won by the South African National Defence Force in handling the exact situation which I've defined to you. And this is the award, and I think the significance of this is I'm going to read the abstract. I'm going to read a very short abstract which sums it up very, very nicely. This was called the Frans Edelman Award for Achievement in Operations, Research, and the Management Sciences. And the heading...
The significance of your testimony at this stage probably it will assist the Commission if we lay the following background. You've come from the white paper. You've gone into the history demonstrating that acquisition doesn't start in 1994, after 1994. You've demonstrated the importance of the sea to South Africa. You've demonstrated the defense review. That was very significant in order to change the outlook of the South African National Defence Force, its outlook, what it needs, where it wants to go into the 21st century. That has been done.
Yes.
Now we are laying a foundation to demonstrate that after the defense review, the country still needed to fulfill the mandate of being safe. And only the defense force, in line with its constitutional mandate, would have to fulfill that. Now, there was no threat. South Africa was not under attack.
Correct.
Now, what South Africa is in at that stage? Is it President Mbeki or is it still President Mandela South Africa?
No, excellent. Mr. Chairman, sir, at that stage, this is 1996 we are talking about now. The president was still President Mandela. And the focus of the discussion in the department was guns or butter, decision support for determining the size and shape of the South African National Defence Force. And Mr. Chairman, so if I could take you through to page 757. At the top of page 757. So the abstract, it says, in January of 1994, the chief of the South African National Defence Force asked the question, in the absence of a conventional military threat, what should the size and shape of the SANDF be? A joint SANDF and Deloitte & Touche team supported the Joint Strategic Management Model with Operations Research and Management Sciences based decision support models. I just want to comment, this is a decision support model. It is not a model which imposes a decision on one, but it is something which is used to inform a decision. The team created the following models: a risk model of the probability and potential impact of various defense contingencies, a growth model of growth potential of force structure elements, as a cost model, a zero-based cost model from start, a mixed integer programming model of all the relationships, and a manual model allowing the user to select different tasks and strategies. The project resulted in a saving on the approved force design size and shape, they say, of more than 22%. The results indicate clear opportunities for major additional funding. So, sir, what this was and what this boiled down to was using probably some of the top brains in the SANDF, informed by the Secretariat, and also outsourcing to use people from Deloitte & Touche, which is a bunch of South African specialists in operations research, to go and work out how we could go and do things so that we could never be accused, and our logic would never be that the force design, the order of battle of South Africa was worked out by a few people in a smoke-filled room. We had to go and do things in the spirit of the new South Africa, to open up and to look at everything. So at this stage, what I would like to do, if I may, if I could lead you to RWH 6 Project Optimum, which goes from page 211 to 754. If I could refer you to page 633 of that.
Commissioners, let's see whether the commissioners are with you. It will be volume 2 of Higgs bundle. The witness would like to refer you to page 633. Let's know whether the commissioners are with us. I see that the commissioners are with us. Before we even start, let me ask this question. The thing that we are happy is that there was no conventional military threat.
Correct.
We'd like to simplify it as to what does it mean in relation to the period in which the country found itself. President Mandela was the president then.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 1994, South Africa was the flavor of the month. Our region was very warm to South Africa. If one looks at South Africa's defense, what had happened in the last few years was undreamt of. And so obviously South Africa had to reappreciate everything. The reality is a country which had been at war with itself was no longer at war with itself. And we had to now chart our new course into the future. And it was with that in mind, and also bearing in mind the imperatives of the Constitution and the White Paper, which said, design for your primary mission, which is to defend and protect South Africa, that a number of contingencies were worked out. These were generic contingencies, having studied conflict in the world over many a year. These were generic contingencies. Across here in this table, sir, we have about 80 of these contingencies. My recollection when I was involved in this is that this is the first iteration, and there were a number more, but it gives you the principle of what was looked at. The reality is we sat and worked out for role 1, defending and protecting South Africa. And I'm going to read through a number just to give people an indication of how thorough and intense this was. Role 1 was invasion or a major composite attack. The TAC 1 would be invasion with a main thrust over the landward border. The next one, invasion from any or all directions. The next one, composite raids, neutralizing raids. The next one, air raids or attacks. Neutralizing, crippling air raids or attacks from Southern Africa. Punitive, coercive air raids or attacks from Southern Africa. Ground-to-ground missile raids or attacks from Southern Africa. Air raids or attacks from long-distance air bases. Then moving into the landward raids, neutralizing landward raids or attacks from Southern Africa. Landward raids, attacks from Southern Africa, neutralizing, crippling special operations raids over landward borders. Punitive, coercive special operations or raids over landward borders. Then on the seaward side, seaward raids and attacks. Maritime long-range air and missile raids and attacks. Maritime medium-range air and missile raids and attacks. Maritime short-range gun and missile raids or attacks. Special operations raids from seawards. Then with regard to isolation or blockades, a threat or disruption to South Africa's sea lines of communication at 2 major local maritime defense areas. threat or disruption of sea lines of communication at one local maritime defense area, disruption of sea lines of communications beyond 200 nautical miles, threats to or disruption of sea lines of communication involving piracy. Just a comment on that. What happened recently with our deployments as part of our anti-piracy responsibilities of SADC, these were one of the issues which was war game then. And because we looked at it generically, we were not surprised. The next one, sir, landward blockades and or threats to common water sources, air blockades and enforcement of no-fly zones, attacks on or threats to offshore assets, which would include our islands, our rigs off Mossel Bay, the release of captured embassies or captured ships or captured aircraft. And as we were referring yesterday, the scenario would be a burning embassy in Central Africa. How would we go and get our embassy staff off that in a very realistic scenario today? Threats to our islands, maritime resource and maritime zone threats. Then just looking further down the page, sir, about Role 2, which refers to peace support operations. There are a number of various peace support operations in the area of strategic interest where the influence is high right the way down. Another task on page 735, the following page, sir. In task 6, Task 6, the first one, defend against internal military threats to the Constitution. In those days, this was a very sensitive thing because we were not sure how we would continue, but we had to do these things in those days. And then moving further down, on Role 4, Task 9, maintenance of law and order, landward border defense against non-military threats, and right the way through. So I'd like to leave that documentation there. The purpose of reading that is just to give you an indication, sir, that we've applied our minds to this. For each of those contingencies, what we did is we drew up various strategies which allowed us to have a look at how we would neutralize that contingency or that generic threat. So we'd have different strategies, and then we would war game those strategies to go and see how effective they were. And I will give you an example. One of the classic examples is the Anglo-Boer War, 450,000 people. Let's put it into modern terms. So you have a major force, a maritime force, which wants to come and achieve a strategic regime change objective here. The probability of that happening is exceedingly low. But the reality is that if it happened, the impact is exceedingly high. And what we did is we would have a look to say, if you've got this big maritime force, let us work out how we're going to counter it. We could use land-based fighter aircraft only, use land-based fighter aircraft together with a surface fleet component, or use fighter aircraft, no surface fleet, but a subsurface fleet with submarines. Or one of them was to say, let us actually allow them to come close to land and use shore artillery, shore-based artillery, to try to counter that. And one of the other strategies which was used is let them come, invade South Africa, take Pretoria, and then we roll them back with guerrilla warfare. And of course, the reality is the impact of that and the damage and destruction to South Africa would be immense, but that is the type of thing which we applied our mind to. And it was in scenarios like that when we had this carried on for a large number of months, and there were a number of people from
under the control of General LaRue from the Air Force, who was a major player in the Defense Review. And we went and got people from the Army, from the Air Force, and from SAMS, and we used to sit for days on end wargaming these. So there's a wargaming thing and going and putting it through. And wargaming is not something which is unique to South Africa. If one looks at wargaming, my alma mater, the United States Naval War College, they wargamed all their scenarios, they've wargamed all their wars. And something which they say they never planned for or surprised them, and this was just prior to Pearl Harbor. They said that they'd predicted virtually everything and they'd wargamed all the scenarios, but they did not wargame, they did not comprehend kamikaze pilots. They did not, with the American mind, ever believe that somebody would do kamikaze tactics to actually tackle the US Navy. So that's just as a parallel side, but the reality is all navies wargame. That is how you test things, because the reality is if you've got to fight, you have got to have fought it before, albeit virtually, so that you can actually go and see and realize and comprehend things. Because when you are fighting, everything changes, and your plans which you've worked out don't necessarily follow what you've expected. But getting back to our scenario here, a major force potentially coming to attack South Africa, sir. The reality is we sat and we played and we wargamed these. And one of the things which we also did to get beyond the service interests is we got a lot of our officers to make sure that they didn't refer to their stuff. So from the Navy side, we would say the example when you're making a point, you must make an Army and an Air Force example. And the Army officers were told, you don't make Army examples, you make Air Force and Navy examples. And for the Air Force, it was the other way around. So it helped us overcome the service prejudices to actually get on top of things. And I'd say one of the major spin-offs, apart from the actual options which came out, one of the major spin-offs from that was it helped people to understand what the other services were about. It was the setting in place the concept of jointness, where all the services together actually achieve the same objective. And you don't end up with services and service rivalry against each other, but everybody is integrated in a very, very smart way. And I think that was brilliant. And one of the interesting things from the Navy side after this, sir, is that some of the strongest proponents for a balance in forces between frigates and submarines were Army and Air Force officers. They were the people saying, listen, if you've got to do this, there's only one way. And the reality is, when we exercised and we wargamed these things from certain scenarios where we would have, as referred to earlier, we'd have a huge number of frigates and no submarines, or no frigates and a huge number of submarines. We ended up deciding and working out that your best defense value for the Navy was a modest number of surface combatants and a modest number of submarines. That gave South Africa, in my mind, the optimum defense value. And in the options which we'll come to just now, made it very clear that you could go and have a look. And in fact, in 3 of the 4 options, there were frigates and submarines in very, very modest numbers. So I think that is fundamental. Generic contingencies, sir, I can recall there being beyond 150 generic contingencies. And from my recollection, and also in speaking with Admiral Christian, because this is 17 years ago, we estimate it was in the vicinity of 6 months that we spent actively involved in this, together with lots of other people.
Now, this all gaming, as we're not involved, you play games in order to satisfy yourself as to what you really need to defend South Africa. Please go back to page 633. Page 633. If you look at item 122, you'll see that punitive coercive air raids, attacks from Southern Africa. That's where the Air Force play a role, isn't it?
Yes. So that would be a significant Air Force thing. It would be Air Force and probably the Army using their ground-based anti-air artillery together with the Air Force in their combinations, whoever was looking after whichever, either guns or missile systems.
If you look at item 130, at the top of it is landward raids attacks. We're talking about the army on the ground.
Yeah. Those are landward raids, neutralizing attacks raids from Southern Africa, which would include the Army and the Air Force fighting. There were certain scenarios or certain strategies where, depending on which country it came across from, the Navy would potentially get involved in going around and landing forces, which would help put pressure on the potential enemy.
I see item 141, seaward raids attacks. This relates to the Navy, isn't it?
Correct, so that would be relating to the Navy and to the Air Force.
So all arms of services, in as far as this whole game is concerned, were considered and they played a role.
Yes. That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Explain to the commissioners from here what has been laid as the basis. Where did it lead to in as far as the options are concerned?
So from here, various figures were used. I refer to the costing. So each of the strategies was costed, and in taking it through the war games, you would then end up with a certain amount of defense value. The defense value and the costing were fed into this computer system which won the award, which then generated options. If you'd say, this is our budget limitation, we want to go and have a look at these various things, and it would then generate a number of potential options which you could consider.
You mentioned a computer system that won an award. Explain that.
So that's exactly the abstract which I read just now. So the war gaming was the actual applying of the minds, the expertise in the National Defence Force, and then that was put together to actually develop various options for the decision makers to actually use that to put tangible options on the line. It would indicate the balance of forces in particular, and I think, as I've mentioned, from the Navy side, it certainly indicated that your best defense value was in a modest number with that combination.
In the military, we work with project. What was this project called?
So this was called Project Optimum.
Explain to the commissioners the significance of this project and how it projected South Africa.
So I think the significance of this is that it won that international award, the France Edelman Award for Achievement in Operations Research and the Management Sciences, because in people discussing it, they indicated that perhaps similar systems had been used by other countries, the British, etc., to try to get those things. We'd just taken it to the principles to a new level to win this international award.
I would like you to take the commission from where you start to manifest this Project Optimum into reality in relation to the options as to what do we achieve as capabilities. Remember, it is a foundation that started with the white paper, the defense review, the consultations that were there, the discussions, the pacifists were considered, whether are we going to make South Africa to have weaponry, or are we going to be a defensive state, are we going to have strong ammunition? Now we're at the stage where there was no war. We come with a simulated war. The Air Force is involved, the Navy is involved, the Army is involved. We satisfy ourselves that we've all gained everything, we feed it into computers, we reduce it. Having cost and budget, we reduce it into a concrete thing. Now we have it. Tell the Commission where it led to with regard to the options of helping us to decide what we achieve as capabilities. We are already going to the nub of the testimony.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just at this stage, I'd also like to comment that whilst the Defence Review was running and Optimum was running parallel to it, there was regular communication between the wargaming teams and the Defence Review work group. And what was used was a lot of the stuff which we were learning from the wargaming and the Optimum stuff was discussed openly in the Defence Review. So it was not kept out just for the Department of Defence in an area marked top secret. It was sat and we explained it to everybody as we went through the Defence Review. But sir, if I may, I would like to take you back to Dr. Rocky Williams's paper which he wrote, because he spells out very, very succinctly the 4 different options which were presented. And he puts together probably 16 pages of Chapter 8 in the Defence Review. He puts it into very smart words and indicates a little bit of background. And in fact, I didn't have those insights until I read this document recently. So if we could do that, sir.
Before you do that, I would like you to lose the commissioners. Inform them what Chapter 8 refers to before you go to Dr. Williams' writing.
So Chapter 8, if I could refer you to the Defence Review for page 96. That, sir, is... Yeah. So it is RWH 5, South African Defence Review, 1998, page 63 to 210.
You are referring specifically to page 96, is that correct?
Please.
Now, remember you explained the concept force design.
Correct.
Now, we have force design options. Please simplify it in such a manner that the Commission appreciates.
Thank you. So on page 96 of the Defence Review, our paginated page 96, it is Chapter 8 of the Defence Review, and it is headed Force Design Options. It starts off with an introduction, and I'd just like to read from the first paragraph before we move to tasks. It says, during peacetime, the SANDF must maintain, develop, and prepare forces that form the basis of its conventional defense capabilities. It must also employ such forces in the execution of secondary functions as described in the white paper and preceding chapters of this report. At all times, the SANDF must be ready to act in defense of South Africa in response to various defense contingencies. Then, sir, if I may, if I could take you down to tasks, which is in paragraph 3 on page 96. It says, to plan and prepare for the execution of the above mission, the tasks associated with the defense needs of South Africa need to be defined. The following tasks are derived from previous chapters of the review. The first one, in paragraph 3, TAC 1, it's providing core defense capabilities for defense of South Africa against external military threats and the execution of military operations in defense of South Africa, its interests and its citizens when so ordered by the President. The second task is 3 TAC 2, providing defense capabilities against internal threats to the constitutional order and the execution of such operations in a state of emergency when so ordered by the President. In 3 TAC 3, promoting regional security through defense cooperation within the SABC framework, the SADC framework. In 3 TAC 4, promoting international security through military cooperation in support of South Africa's foreign policy. In 3 TAC 5, providing a military capability for participation in regional and international peace support operations. In 3 TAC 6, providing and applying forces for land, air, and maritime border protection against non-military threats. In 3 TAC 7, it's providing a capability to maintain law and order in cooperation with the South African Police Service on an ongoing basis. There's a qualifying comment here that this will remain necessary until the police are able to fulfill the task without assistance from the military, other than in exceptional circumstances. In 3 TAC 8, it is providing surveillance and enforcement support to relevant authorities for protection of marine resources, control of marine pollution, and maritime law enforcement. In 3 TAC 9, providing air traffic control services in support of civil aviation authorities. In 3 TAC 10, providing military support for the preservation of life, health, and property in emergency situations where the scale of the emergency temporarily exceeds the capacity of the relevant civil authorities. In 3 TAC 11, providing emergency capabilities for the maintenance of essential services which have been temporarily disrupted and where the capacity of the relevant civil authorities is exceeded. In 3 TAC 12, providing medical and health services in support of relevant authorities in accordance with approved policy. In 3 TAC 13, providing search and rescue support to the relevant authorities in accordance with domestic agreements and South Africa's international obligations. Just a comment on that, when we were referring to maritime zones, the area, the search and rescue area of the sea which we are responsible for includes 16 million square kilometers. In 3 TAC 14, providing an air transport service for VIPs and other officials in accordance with approved policy. And in any democracy, there's always contention in that one. 3 TAC 15, providing support to other state departments for missions to the Antarctic and Southern Ocean. 3 TAC 16, providing hydrographic services to South African mariners and in compliance with the international obligations of the Republic of South Africa. In 3 TAC 17, providing an infrastructure for the management of the service corps. And in 3 TAC 18, providing a communications security service to other state departments. With regard to the national key points, that's obviously discussed and described at various points depending on who owns that. The next issue, sir, was the force design logic. It said, notwithstanding this extensive list of tasks, the white paper provides that the Defence Force should resolve chiefly around the SANDF's primary function of defence against military aggression. While the process of force design involves considerable military technical detail, the design is determined largely by decisions regarding 3 parameters: the level of defense required, the approved defense posture, and the defense budget. Those three are key to it. The level of defense is reflected in the definition. So I can't read this. I've actually lost a print here. I must just check this if you wouldn't mind, sir. I'm just going to the original. Yeah. Oh, there we go. I've got it from the original. So if I could start that paragraph again. The level of defense is reflected in the definition, scale, and intensity of military operations associated with the defense contingencies and tasks discussed in Chapter 3 of this report. The size and configuration of the defense capabilities are in turn strongly influenced by the choice of defense posture as elaborated in Chapter 2 of the Defense Review. The process is further constrained by budgetary guidelines and the costs associated with particular capabilities. In summary, the force design of the SANDF is needs-driven but cost-constrained, as I mentioned earlier. While the process is intended to produce a force design representing the best defense value for money within the selected parameters, as we've discussed with Optimum and the wargaming, it may not be possible to ensure the capabilities for a required level of defense within a restrictive budget. The resulting imbalance or inadequacy in defense capability represents a risk to the country, which must either be accepted or reduced by other means. Throughout the process, there is thus an interplay of political judgment and military expertise. And I think that was optimally done with regard to the consultations.
I see that mention is being made of defense posture. In your own words, simplify it to the Commission.
Thank you very much, sir. Defense posture has a large section of a chapter written on it in the Defense Review. And the posture is fundamental to the change in South Africa. The posture is defined as being primarily defensive, where we did not want to have our neighbors believing that we had the intention of creating an arms race or any undue pressure on them where they would not allow their priorities, etc., to go through their normal processes. So that posture, in fact, limited certain defense equipment. We didn't want to have anything such as long-range bombers, which may cause concern in the region. And great cognizance was taken with that when we were determining options, which led to the actual eventual force design and the procurement, particularly of our Gripen fighters. But a comment whilst I was being prepared for this, it is very interesting. We're looking at South Africa post where we've just been, and we were discussing Bangui, etc. If we had long-range bombers, maybe if the elected civil authorities had decided, they may have had the option to have actually deployed from Pretoria a bomber to achieve a mission, if that was necessary. But the reality is it impacted on our force design. So we took that away. We took that option away. Yesterday, Mr. Chairman, I spoke of Project Millennium. Project Millennium, possibly in those days, would have been seen to be contrary to our posture, because I think our level of relationships with the region was still very new for the new South Africa. Today, that has changed considerably, because a few years ago, our Chief of the Navy arranged a SADC conference concerning an expeditionary capability. And the reality is all the navies of SADC said that they would most certainly support a capability, a strategic employment capability, a force projection capability like that. So it was very much a function of the times, but with consequences. Because the reality is you have a force design, you buy your equipment, that is 30 years you're putting in there. So the assumptions which we made, the posture has got huge ramifications, and that is what is inherent to what we were doing.
Having read what you've read from page 96 to page 97 of your bundle, volume 1, and the tasks, please advise the Commission as to whether these considerations were considered during the defense review debates, especially by those who were pacifist, who were arguing that democracy does not attack democracy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That was a very interesting postulation, and I can recall in one consultative conference, and in fact, if you don't mind, I'll use names, Terry Crawford Brown, as a full participatory member, as a pacifist, he came and he said, "Sir, democracies don't tackle democracies." And what was very interesting, at that stage, there was conflict between Spain and Canada over fishing rights and fishing waters. And these are two NATO partners. The Spanish deployed warships to protect their fishing vessels off Canada. It happened at the same time as the defense review. So the realities, these things were being discussed, and we were so fortunate also to have the insight then of Deputy President Mbeki, and he entered into the discussion with regard to democracies fighting democracies with the brilliance which he has to actually be able to explain those things, and has taken that through. So everybody participated, from Deputy President Mbeki then to Terry Crawford Brown, and everybody could hear the arguments. Everybody heard the arguments, and the reality is democracies have interests. And when the democracy's interests clash with another democracy, the first level is negotiation, but when the things get down, it depends on who's actually prepared to go and put force on the table, or to have the threat of force on the table. And then, of course, two equal threats measure up. And if you've got two strong powers, then they find something else. But if you've got a strong power and you've got a democracy with no military capability whatsoever, then the chances are that other democracy is not really going to do so well. But this is the subject of many discussions, and over late nights and drinking lots of coffee, this was heavily discussed, Mr. Chairman.
As at that stage, the reality of acquiring capabilities and South Africa facing an external military threat was on the ground.
So if we just repeat the question, sir.
As at that stage, at the defense review, when these debates were taking place, there was reality that capabilities have to be acquired in defense of South Africa against an external military threat.
That is correct. That is correct, and that is what filtered through all the huge debates which were held.
Is there anything that you still want to deal with at this stage? Because I thought that we're taking us to the writing of Mr. Williams, unless you want to deliberate on the defense review that we're fully done with at this stage.
Mr. Chair, if you're happy, sir, I'm very comfortable to go to Dr. Williams's description of the four force design options. So this is RWH 8, and in particular, so if I could refer you to...
The commissioners would like us to identify the page first. It's RWH 8, commissioners, from page 761, volume 2 to page 779. The witness is just going to go to the relevant portions. That will be volume 2 of his bundle, commissioners. It starts on page 761. I see the chairperson is nodding. At this stage, a number of things have come out clearly. The first design, the order of battle, the posture, the fundamentals pertaining to the change in South Africa. We do not want to scare our neighbors and flex our muscles. The first doctrine, how we fight. We've gone through all consultative process. Now we have to decide what options are we weighing, what type of equipment we will get, please. You may proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So I'd like to refer you to page 765. Paginated 765. And I'd like to start with the unnumbered paragraph at the bottom of the page, starting with the focus on the primary military function. So it says, the focus on the primary military function was reflected in the final force design which both Parliament and Cabinet approved. Initially, 4 force design options were proposed. The basic difference between these options are as outlined below.
We are at a stage where everything is ready now. We have to make a choice of these capabilities. What are we going to choose? How are we going to fund them? And I'm going to be certain that the commissioners are with us. I see they're nodding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Option 1. This option was the recommended option of both the Department of Defense and the Joint Standing Committee on Defense, and was the option finally approved by the South African Cabinet. It argued for the maintenance of a minimum growth core which could meet a wide range of contingencies, bar invasion by major powers. It also argued for the maintenance of force levels, part-time and full-time, in the region of 101,000 personnel. Lowering of air defense capabilities, restricted maritime capabilities, and limited landward capabilities. This option reflected a bias towards traditional defense contingencies, but acknowledged that certain secondary functions, involvement of the South African Army in the interior, for example, would continue to remain a defense role in the foreseeable future.
Explain to the commissioners about the role that Parliament and Cabinet played in this regard and how we ended up there, in as far as the interests of the South African National Defence Force are concerned.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The reality is this was not the preferred option for the Department of Defence. The preferred option of the Department of Defence was something a little bit more expensive and a little bit more ambitious. But it was seen that this made best sense at that time. And for option 2, we will read that. But the reality is, in my understanding and for my personal experience, I was not linked up to any cabinet briefings, but in my understanding, in interfacing with Parliament and the Joint Standing Committee of Defence, they were along with us through the entire process. And my understanding also is that with everybody who participated fully and was fully included in the defence review, Parliament, in our democracy, having accepted something, is the people have spoken. That was my personal interpretation of it. And I think it's of fundamental importance. And the other three, it's good to look at them because it actually, in a way, brings more credibility to the option one, which was chosen by Cabinet and by the Joint Standing Committee and de facto by Parliament, who approved the Defence Review.
I would actually like you to simplify things by taking the commissioners to page 109 and 1110 of Manual 1. I would like you to speak to these options in line on the writings of Mr. Williams, having explained the options to the commissions in the context of what you see on page 109 and 110 of your bundles. I'm going to request that the commissioners should actually go to both 109 and 110 so that we should make them to appreciate the options themselves and the explanation by Mr. Williams. Let's see whether the commissioners are on page 109, 110. I see the commissioners are not in members.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. So I would like to read option 2 from Dr. Williams's document on one hand, and on the other hand, if you would keep the Defence Review force design options open to page 109. Option 2, this reflected the, quote, ideal, unquote, vision of the Department of Defence, and as such was dubbed the, quote, Department of Defence Long-Term Vision Force Design, unquote. This option was predicated virtually in its entirety on a traditional account of defence roles and contingencies and reflected the influence of Western cultural concepts on the defence planners within the Department of Defence. It catered for conventional contingencies, excluding invasions by major powers, but scaled down on the involvement of the SANDF in support of the South African police services within the interior. Now, this is significant. It argued for force levels in the region of 135,000 personnel, part-time and full-time, and for the procurement of conventional equipment slightly more extensive and more expensive than that recommended in option 1. Now, sir, I think just the thing to bear in mind, the National Defence Force today, as we stand, we have just under 80,000 people who are in the regular force, and we have approximately 14,000 people who are active in our reserves. So we are sitting with a total of just below 95,000. Option 2 was calling de facto for an additional 40,000 people in the mix. And I think that that's one of the fundamental differences. And it's good to keep that in the back of one's mind as we go further down the line. Then moving into option 3. And option 3 was a very, very different option. Option 3 was strongly resisted by defence planners during the Defence Review process. It was introduced into the debate by members of a civil society strategic think tank who had been co-opted onto the Defence Review working group by the Minister of Defence. It was retained as an option because it was felt that it realistically reflected the likely roles and tasks that the Defence Force was currently executing and was likely to execute in the future. This option advocated a shift from conventional to non-conventional operational concepts in its force design logic and argued strongly for a consideration of secondary functions in the force design and budgetary process. As such, it reduced the Army's conventional capabilities, replacing them with increased counterinsurgency and landward peace operations capabilities. It limited the Navy's conventional capabilities through the removal of the corvettes, slant frigates, and the submarines. So there were no frigates or submarines in this mix. And placed a greater emphasis on the Air Force's transport capabilities. So the reality is, this option, it was put to the decision makers. This option would not have satisfied the constitutional imperatives, I would argue. but it was there, and as such, it helped inform the decision makers because the option was put on the table to the elected civil authority decision makers. Sorry, sir. Option 4. Initially, there was some reluctance to consider option 4, premised as it was on theories of non-offensive defense, which cut back or made our posture even more extreme to be so defensive. This had been introduced into the defense debate during the post-1994 period, and it was premised on the same level of defense as option 1, but did this within the framework of a defensive posture. Accordingly, it enhanced the role of territorial protection, landward rear defense, air defense capabilities, fighter and radar capabilities, for instance. Helicopter support to landward was increased, and naval capabilities were also highlighted, with a greater emphasis on inshore patrol capabilities. Its adherence to traditional defensive operational concepts limited its broader utility to participate in other secondary functions. So it was the fourth option, and it was based on non-offensive defense. So the big thing is, for the defense value, it was not as cost-effective as option 1 and option 2, but it was put there as an option because that was the spirit of what we were doing. So I think those 4 options covered very, very well the broad objectives of everybody. And if one looks at that, I'm going to read from Dr. Williams further. He says, option 1 was finally approved by Cabinet, although acknowledgement was made of the ideal vision enshrined in option 2. A second report detailing the force structure required for the Department of Defense for the future head office reorganization and support structures, the acquisition process, and land and environment considerations was also tabled and approved by both Parliament and Cabinet in May 1998. And the Defence Review was finally tabled in Parliament as a composite document on the 22nd of May in 1998.
With this analogy, I would like you to take the commissioners to page 109 and 110 of volume 1 of your Bible to make them appreciate these options. You could demonstrate to them what was offered or provided for the Navy as far as the Project Optimum is concerned. What was provided for the Air Force. The Air Force will come and talk to what was provided to them. And the preferences.
Super.
The Navy will prefer to have.
Mr. Chairman, sir, if we could look at page 110 on the South African Navy. And I will go through.
I think the right way is to start at 109.
Okay.
Introduce the document.
Okay.
Explain the Air Force design
Okay.
alternatives. Please show the commissioners that the Army was considered, the Air Force was considered.
Correct.
And then we can complete with
Sure.
the head on as a Navy
Okay.
officer. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Sir, at the top of page 109, it indicates, and this is the crux of the matter, the SANDF force design alternatives, and it runs down on page 109. It's got the Army, and then the Air Force, and then, of course, the 4 columns. The option 1, the option 2, 3, and 4, and the option 1, the recommended option, and the option which was accepted by Parliament and by Cabinet. And as such, if we move down onto the next page now, it refers specifically to the Navy. Option 1, which was recommended, which had 4 submarines and 4 corvettes. That is the crux of the matter. Further down the line, the only difference in reality between it and the other broad option was the difference between option 1 and 2, which is very similar, and then in option 4, where there were 6 additional inshore patrol vessels which were added for the right-hand column. So the crux of it, the most important thing, the most important take-home, is option 1, with 4 submarines and 4 corvettes, frigates. Option 2, the same. Option 3 had none. And option 4 had exactly the same, sir.
What did the cabinet decide with regard to these options?
What cabinet decided is that option 1, which included 4 submarines and 4 corvettes, should be accepted.
What is the actual reality of what the Navy got?
Mr. Chairman, sir, the reality is the Navy got 4 corvette frigates and 3 submarines.
Now, we know that Project Optimum helped generate these options. And we know that the cabinet finally made a decision. Did the Defense Force, South African National Defense, play any significant role in the decision to get these options?
I'm not aware of any additional briefings bar that, which I'm sure we discussed at the highest level. I did not participate in any of those potential very, very close discussions, Mr. Chairman.
But what do you make up? Probably the chief of the SANDF might come and educate us at the right time. What do you make out of the fact that it is cabinet and parliament that prevailed?
I think that is very good, Mr. Chairman, because de facto we are democracy. They are the decision makers. We, the military, provide options to them. These were 4 very broad, very rational options. The third one, I don't believe, met our constitutional mandate, but I think that option 1, option 2, and option 4 would potentially have met the mandate.
Now we are gravitating towards where these capabilities are coming. Cabinet has decided that the Navy will have 4 corvettes, 4 submarines now. Not to confuse issues for the benefit of all and sundry. What's the difference between a corvette and a frigate?
So the background to this, there's a little bit of humor in this. A corvette generally is a slightly smaller vessel than a frigate. A frigate is a slightly bigger vessel. And the issue with regard to corvettes, where it came into the mix, is at a certain stage in our history when the Navy said we needed frigates. The major decision makers then were Army generals, and they said, Navy, forget frigates. You guys are going to get corvettes. And I think that's ultimately where the thing started from. But the reality is what we looked for, we wanted a vessel which could operate autonomously. It could go on its own. If we'd ended up with 1,500-ton vessels, we would not have gone to achieve all the things which I will reflect on later in my testimony. We would have been significantly hampered. And the reality is that, as people say, steel is cheap. The weapon systems inside the ships, those capabilities, that is where the money, lots of money lies. The reality is for our seas off here, our huge seas, and I hope that the Commission will be able to observe some of those seas in our video clippings, which we intend showing. Our seas are miserable, and you want big ships. A 3,500-ton frigate is perfectly able to operate and to achieve and to help us overcome the problems which we've had in the past. The last time we had proper frigates here was up till 1985, as Admiral Green testified yesterday. And the reality is this has allowed us to replace that frigate capability. And it is good.
Is that the process that made us to got the strike craft? Because at one time, because of the embargo and the sanctions, we could not update our frigates.
So we got the strike craft, and I think Admiral Schultz might be able to add more to that logic. When we got the strike craft, that was 1977. At that stage, we still had 3 frigates. We had 3 British-built President-class frigates which were operating. And then, of course, on top of that, we ended up getting the strike craft, 3 from Israel and 6 built here. So we started that process. And I think it was a function of the historic context where that came through. As I alluded to earlier on, the Chief of the Navy at that stage, I believe, was not in favor of the strike craft, and he was told to accept them.
Yeah, you mentioned the importance of Britain and its influence on our Navy, and that we acquired frigates from them. I just want you to explain, because you demonstrated the history of acquisition, that it was a process. It was governed by policies and projects. We did not go deeper into it. It's a witness would come and do that. I think that the Rashuds would deal with those projects, explaining the historical link of the acquisitions, how we always wanted to have frigates, how we always wanted to have submarines. But of significance is, I would like you to tell the Commission whether we eventually got frigates or corvettes.
Okay.
Draw the difference.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So if you Google corvettes or frigates, you will see there's a fine line. Today we've got crossovers and we've got SUVs and we've got all these various things, and there's a bit of a fine line. Generally, a corvette, you're probably looking at something in the vicinity of up to 2,000, maybe 2,000 tons. Our frigates, they are 3,500 tons. So as part, if you look at the defense review, you'll see it was Corvette Slant frigate for a number of the actual documentation which came through. Because the reality is we had to get something which would allow us to achieve certain things. So the technicality, they were called initially corvettes because of where we are, but according to international norm, a vessel with that capability is in fact a frigate. So we say it's a patrol corvette. In other words, it's a frigate-sized vessel, but with very moderate corvette-type armaments inside it, because it is certainly not a very highly armed vessel. I think it's a modestly armed vessel.
The option 1 gave us gave the Navy 4 frigates and 4 submarines. In actual reality, how many submarines and how many frigates? And I know that I could repeat these questions. How many did the Navy get?
So the Navy got 4 frigates and we got 3 submarines. With regard to the submarines, there were 3 submarines. I believe I was not involved with the acquisition. And I think perhaps Captain Jordan will be able to give better testimony to that. But my understanding was 3 with the option of a 4th one. So I think that's how that was handled with regard to the submarines in particular.
We're at a stage where we have to deal with the utilization of these frigates and submarines. And I see that the time is 5 minutes to 4. I would like us to utilize this 5 minutes. You remember in the initial stage of your testimony, we took you through your sworn statement where you mentioned that you're going to testify about strategic utilization of these capabilities. Now they've acquired them, but let's start here. Explain to the Commission the sentiment about acquiring these frigates and submarines by detailing their names. Let's start with the submarines. Give the historical perspective where their names come from and how they relate to South Africa. Let's start with the submarines.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So the first of our submarines is S101, which is the SAS Montetisi. Montetisi was a queen warrior who achieved great military success in the early 19th century. The decision to give her that name, it's a political decision, as with all the frigates and the submarines. And that's come down, and I think that Montetisi, as I will testify to later on, played a significant role in putting us on the map with NATO, which I'll speak to tomorrow. She was the first submarine. So Montetisi it's a regal name for a war-fighting lady queen. The second submarine is SAS Charlotte Maxeke, and she's named after the great activist, the great social and political activist in our history, of which hospitals, streets, and numerous things are named after. So she's very much more a modern activist in South Africa. And then the third of our submarines is Queen Majaji the First. And Queen Majaji is named after the Rain Queen. So each of them were named after heroines. They were named after women who have made their mark in history. The reality is our submarines, when I served at sea in submarines, there were no women at sea in submarines. And in fact, so if you allow me a little bit of humor, my wife, she said to me when I was at sea in a submarine, she said, "What if there are women at sea in submarines? I'm not letting you go to sea in a submarine." But the reality is, it just shows how everything has changed. We've got women serving at sea in submarines, and there is no issue. The reality is, in a submarine, there's no privacy. You have zero privacy. In our Daphne submarines, you didn't shower. You'd go to sea for 28 days without showering, etc. The new submarines are a lot better. We can make our own fresh water in them, so it's reasonable. But the reality is, you need tough professionals to go to sea. We need tough women, and we've got them. We've got them, and they're wonderful. So those are the submarines, and I wanted to mention the women and the issue of women in submarines because that's new. The United States is now only starting to introduce women into their submarines. There are very few submarine services in the world with women at sea in submarines, but we are right at the forefront. And in fact, on a number of our defense magazines and naval magazines, you'll see pictures of our women submariners, and we're very proud of them.
The last part of your testimony today, before we go to strategic utilization of these capabilities, is for you to tell the Commission about the frigates and their names, sentiments, and how they also link to South Africa.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. So the first of our frigates is the SAS Amatola. She's named after the mountain range in the Eastern Cape. In fact, on the side, that is just near where I was born. And she's named after the battles between the Xhosa and the British around 1852. The second of our frigates is the SAS Isandlwana, which is named after the battle between the Zulus and the British. The third of our frigates is the SAS Spioenkop, and she's named after the battle between the Boers and the British. What is interesting to note, also a little bit of humor, no dig, but in all of those battles the British lost, and the Xhosa won, the Zulu won, and the Boers won. So whenever we exercise with the Royal Navy, they say, "Gee, you guys always rub it in." But then the third one, and it's the fourth one, is the SAS Mendi. She's named after SS Mendi, which was a troop ship which was taking a number of South Africans to fight in the First World War. And she was sunk at sea in a collision, funny enough, just off Britain. And there was tragic loss of life. The Reverend Isaac Jorba is recorded as having got everybody to stand on the deck of Mendi as she went down, and heroically those people went down, and there's poems written about it, and it's very touching. And so if you don't mind, if I could just touch perhaps on the deployment of Mendi. When our frigates were delivered, sir, they were built but not fitted out in Germany. The hulls were built, they were put together in Germany, they were brought to Simonstown, and we fitted the combat suites, the weapon systems, etc. in Simonstown. All three of them arrived, and Mendi arrived at the end of 2004. And at that stage, the Chief of the Navy agreed that we could take Mendi to show her to the people of South Africa. And we took Mendi up to East London. And I remember a member of the Naval Reserves, he got the Premier of the Eastern Cape, Premier Balindlela. She came on board Mendi, and there were a number of people who came on board Mendi. She came on board in her traditional outfit, with her circles in her feet, on her face with a painting and the beautiful dresses, barefoot. And she said, Admiral, in fact, at that stage I was a captain, I think Admiral Schultz was the Admiral there. She said, this is the spiritual return of the people who lost their lives in Mendi. She said, when somebody is born, the umbilical is buried in that kraal. And when you come back, the spirit comes back. There's major linkage with regard to that. And she was so impressed by that ship. She asked through Chief of the Navy if she could take her cabinet to sea in Mendi. And we were going out to sea, and we took her cabinet, and she recited the poem of Mendi and the heroism of the people who lost their lives, the South Africans who lost their lives in Mendi in 1917. But she's a tough lady. She got her cabinet to go and interpret it. And she was there in the wardroom, and it was on national TV. And she said that Mendi and that frigate symbolized to her the new transformed South Africa. She said, this ship, it's the most modern ship in the world, which it is. And I'll talk about that tomorrow. There's not a frigate in the world which looks more modern than that. She said, here we've got men and women of all races and all religions making this beautiful ship work. She said, this is the new transformed South Africa. And she said that on national TV. It was actually quite amazing, because obviously there was controversy about acquisition, etc. There always is. But the reality is that message went home. And I just felt so privileged to be there at that stage. And that was possibly the first time we took one of these beautiful vessels and introduced it to the people of South Africa. Mr. Chair, so that was actually a very, very touching moment, and I just wanted to end off today, if we're not going to continue further, just with regard to that, for people to reflect on. The reality is, I believe, if I'm taking off my uniform now, I'm putting on my clothes as a patriot, just a civilian. I am so proud of what we have. Those frigates, and you'll hear, and the submarines tomorrow, but Mendi, what Mendi did, people were virtually crying. And Balanglair, that we went out onto the flight deck, and it was amazing. It was almost a spiritual thing. All of a sudden, there were dolphins, and there was fish, and there were birds. It was the most bizarre experience. And I remember talking to her people and saying, what is the color of the sea? She said, azure blue. It was the most perfect day. And when that ship came alongside, and that footage was on TV through South Africa, in my mind, that was a turning point. That was a major turning point. And I think that's the beginning of the internal strategic utilization, which I will never forget.
The parting shot is that even with the Amatola, there's a poem that some of us recited at school. I hope when the Amatola went for his voyage, there was a recitation. That's where we part ways for the day. Thank you, Admiral. Commissioners, over to you.
Thanks. The Mendi thing. It's big ticket, eh? It's big ticket. I'll tell you, that was people were crying. Yeah.